facto president and new former presidential candidate Jeanine Áñez resigned from the presidential race in order to support a right-wing candidate Carlos Mesa. In the U.S., the unemployment rates continue to rise amid the COVID-19 pandemic, while the numbers of North American citizens applying for unemployment benefits is also on the rise. Ugandan security forces continue to search of over 200 inmates who escaped from prison in the northeast of the country. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Laura Palmeiro. In Bolivia, the de facto president and now former presidential candidate Jeanine Áñez resigned from the presidential race in order to support right-wing candidate Carlos Mesa, second in the polls. Jeanine Áñez announced her withdrawal from the electoral race one day after the widest electoral poll placed her in fourth place in voting intention, far from even being able to contest in second round. Last Tuesday, the Community of Citizens Party filed a complaint before the Supreme Electoral Court against Áñez for using an official TV broadcast to issue an electoral speech, which analysts describe as a desperate measure. With 5% in recent polls, Áñez stood behind the far-right Luis Fernando Camacho, former President Carlos Mesa, and progressive candidate Luis Arce, who leads the poll and represents the party of former President Evo Morales, the MAS IPSP.
Today, I put aside my candidacy for the presidency of Bolivia to take care of democracy. It is not a sacrifice, it is an honor, because I do it because of the risk that the democratic vote will be divided among several candidates, and that as a result of that division, the MAS ends up winning the election.
Bolivia's ombudswoman Nadia Cruz has presented a report accusing the de facto president Jeanine Áñez of crimes against humanity committed against the Bolivian people during the coup against former President Evo Morales in November last year.
The interim government committed crimes against humanity during the post-electoral conflict, having engaged in systematic killings of the civilian population, with the knowledge of orders and instructions issued by the current government administration, as well as in acts of torture by the Bolivian police. The report states crisis violation of human rights in Bolivia, October to December 2019, presented by the ombudswoman Nadia Cruz, describes and shows the violation of rights, the violent acts, and the situations in which 37 deaths occurred, of which 27 committed during the joint intervention of the Bolivian police and the armed forces in Sacaba, Sencata, and in southern neighborhoods of La Paz.
Meanwhile, social organizations have pointed out that the report presented by the Ombudswoman Office is an act of justice in favor of victims of the political persecution carried out by the de facto floating government of Jeanine Áñez. Members of the Association of Victims, Deceased and Wounded of the Sencata massacre have noted that the report includes their denunciations regarding the repressive acts and assassinations that the coup regime has attempted to cover up. This Thursday, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro accused the opposition leadership of the National Assembly of stealing thousands of US dollars belonging to the Venezuelan state.
The National Assembly was destroyed. The National Assembly was put at the service of foreign interventionism, imperialist interventionism. The National Assembly was turned into an instrument to steal more than $30 million belonging to the nation.
Likewise, President Maduro reiterated the European Union that parliamentary elections will be held on December 6, in line with the Venezuelan constitution.
And the European Union is thinking about it. It was asking us for something impossible, to suspend the mandatory constitutional elections of 2020. I suggest that the European Union thinks carefully about improving our relations, to have a permanent dialogue, as we are doing, and to think better of this. In Venezuela, there will be elections. In Venezuela, there will be a new National Assembly. And you, as the European Union, you cannot continue to stick to the script of Donald Trump on trying to replace the authorities of Venezuela.
And Peru's Constitutional Tribunal has approved the lawsuit presented by the executive branch seeking the blocked vacancy motion presented against President Martín Vizcarra over corruption allegations. The lawsuit was accepted by a majority of 6 votes against 1. However, the Constitutional Tribunal rejected the bid to block Congress from summoning President Vizcarra to address the corruption allegations against him in the Richard Cisneros case. Likewise, the court rejected the proposal that sought to increase the number of votes required in Parliament to remove President Vizcarra from office from 87 to 104. Meanwhile, Constitutional Tribunal Chairwoman Marianela Ledesma noted that the lawsuit was approved, taking into consideration that several parliamentary groups had expressed their intention not to support the presidential vacancy motion. Meanwhile, President Vizcarra is due to attend Congress on Friday to respond over the current controversy linking him with acts of corruption. According to recent revelations, Colombia's National Protection Unit, a government entity in charge of protecting people at risk of their union, social or political activity, actually worked to keep a non-criminal safe. Our correspondent Hernán Tovar has the story.
National Protection Unit, UNP, in Colombia denounced the protection granted to an offender who belonged to the Trayona Resistance Bloc of Self-Defense, an organization that committed more than 290 homicides in the Sierra Marta, Nevada. Norberto Quiroga, aka 55, was submitted to the Justice and Peace Law in 2007, and his extradition to the United States was suspended.
It is incredible to think that an offender had a security scheme granted by the government through the National Protection Unit. He had 3 men armed with 9mm pistols, anti-bullet vests, and a shielded vehicle for his protection, all to preserve his life, and the most incredible thing is that it has been supplied by the state.
Quiroga, aka 55, continued his criminal activities. According to the authorities, he was the head of the Pachenca criminal network, which commit felonies in La Guajira and the Department of Magdalena, with a strong presence in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. President Iván Duque was the one who announced that Quiroga was captured.
In a meticulous intelligence operation alias 55, that boss of the Pachenca, killers of social leaders involved in drug trafficking and in proselytism, was captured today. It is incredible that the management of the UNP did not detect this type of individuals infiltrated in the program, and it's not the first time that happened, but this example does risk the lives of many people who do need a real scheme that takes years or months requesting it, and many of them have been denied that privilege.
Currently and during the year, over 200 reports have been made of social leaders and human rights activists killed, people that have been threatened and killed for his social activities. This is the radiography of how the state institutions do not guarantee the safety of the social fighters.
This is the proof of the criminality of this state that favors with protection schemes and state resources criminals who walk out of the law and taking advantages of the most solid scheme of the protection unit, while the leaders work totally defenseless in their territories and even in Bogota, where we live seriously threatened.
The unions that make up the UNP ask its director to address these situations. They say they will watch what's happening, so that whatever happened it's properly investigated, since these situations are humbling for UNP and its guards. This usage of the resources to protect criminals impacts people who really need this protection and do not have it, paying this with their lives.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away.
Follow the most important global events through a comprehensive perspective. With a team of journalists in 25 locations around the world to convey our people's reality. from the South. Weekdays, only on TeleSUR.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sean todos muy bienvenidos a Vidas. Hay lugares donde el arte se unifica con el orgullo de los pueblos. Y esos lugares están llenos de colores, alegría, pasión, tradiciones, arraigo, valor y entrega.
Real Life, Fridays, only on TeleSUR. Who's moving the chessmen? What interests and motivate the actors behind each event? The board is deployed there. Critical Move investigates every event from Monday to Friday. Only on TeleSUR.
Welcome back to From the South. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was welcomed in Guyana this Thursday with protests against U.S. interest in the country's oil fields, as well as moves to use the neighboring countries to increase pressure on the Venezuelan government of Nicolás Maduro. Mike Pompeo became the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit Suriname and Guyana this Thursday, as the discovery of oil sparks new interest in the small South American nations. Pompeo arrived in Suriname Thursday morning, where he met with the president as well as representatives of the U.S. companies residents in the country, active in the extractive industry of the country, including in the fields of gold mining and offshore oil exploration. Pompeo then headed to Guyana, the second stop of a three-day tour that will also take him to Colombia and the Amazonian border areas of Brazil, as part of Washington's campaign to increase pressure on the neighboring governments of Venezuela. Local media in Guyana have questioned Pompeo's interest in the country and demanded to know details of secret arrangements between local politicians and U.S. corporation ExxonMobil, which, according to several media reports, recently purchased another 2 oil blocks in the country. According to a recent report on children and COVID-19 in the United States, based on data from 49 states, almost 550,000 children have been diagnosed with the novel coronavirus since the onset of the pandemic. The joint report from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Children's Hospital Association shows the U.S. is seeing a spike in COVID-19 cases in children. According to the report, nearly 73,000 new child cases were reported from August 27th from September 10th, representing a 15% increase in child cases over 2 weeks. The report notes that at this time, severe illness due to COVID-19 remains rare among children, but stresses that states should continue to provide detailed reports on COVID-19 cases, testing hospitalizations and mortality by age and race ethnicity, so that the effects of the COVID-19 on children's health can be documented and monitored. Also in the U.S., the unemployment rates continue to rise amid the COVID-19 pandemic, while the numbers of North American citizens applying for unemployment benefits is also on the rise. The Labor Department said on Thursday that U.S. jobless claims fell by 33,000 from the previous week. Close to 12.6 million jobless people are claiming the traditional unemployment benefits. Comparing to a year ago, there were only 1.7 million applied for the benefit. The overall economy, as measured by the gross domestic product, collapsed at an annual rate of 31% from April through June. Authorities in the Czech Republic announced a decision to reinforce COVID-19 restrictions this Thursday, including the closure of bars, restaurants and nightclubs by midnight, in a bid to curb a recent surge in coronavirus cases.
That is that the situation is not good. The epidemic is gaining strength, which is obvious from the data that we release on a regular basis. The number of people hospitalized is on the rise. It is clear that if we don't adopt more restrictive measures and if we don't abide by the current ones, the situation will be serious. We need to face it. We don't live in a normal situation. We don't live in a normal time, and all of us have to behave accordingly.
Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has stressed that the foreign attempt to generate an internal conflict in the country has failed, noting that security forces have safeguarded the country's peace and sovereignty. President Lukashenko made these statements during a meeting with pro-government women's organization in the capital, Minsk. He also announced the closure of the country's borders with Lithuania, Poland and Ukraine, while also calling on the populations of these neighboring countries to stop their government's aggressive policy of interference and oppose any attempt at war. He added that together with Czech Republic, the governments of Lithuania, Poland and Ukraine act as U.S. satellite states, supporting the destabilization attempts against Belarus. President Lukashenko won the presidential elections held on August 9th with 80% of the vote, while the leader of the opposition, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who did not recognize the results, secured just 10% of the votes. Chinese health authorities reported 32 new COVID-19 cases on Thursday, marking the highest daily increase since August 10th. The National Health Commission noted that all new cases were imported, of which 13 were recorded in the northwestern Shaanxi province and 12 in Shanghai. Meanwhile, no locally transmitted cases have been reported across mainland China for over a month. The total number of confirmed COVID-19 cases now stands at over 85,000, while the death toll remains unchanged, at just over 4,600. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us.
TeleSUR English presents a weekly program to discuss the political, economic and social issues affecting the Caribbean community. We'll challenge stereotypes and unpack the diversity of the region through the analysis of unique cultures, religions and art. We Caribbean. Wednesdays, only on TeleSUR.
Welcome back to From the South, and we leave now to the UN, where the SDG Moment 2020 is being held. The event was convened by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, bringing together heads of state and head of governments of United Nations member states, as well as leaders from a range of SDG partners, to identify the changes needed to recover better from COVID-19 pandemic.
Needed to address climate change.
The region generates some 40% of GDP, but only 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. This shows the region has made some progress towards decarbonizing its economy. The region must further reduce energy use. Buildings' energy needs produce 40% of CO2 emissions. Improving building energy efficiency can deliver massive climate gains and create millions of jobs. Countries must reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and accelerate investment in renewables and low-carbon technologies. As we enter the last 10 years of Agenda 2030, I invite all governments to work with us to make the circular economy a reality.
Our region contributes only with 8.3% of global emissions, yet is highly vulnerable to climate change. Climate action should be the driving force to recover and build back better. With job-intensive and carbon-free investments, our region pledged a collective target of 70% renewable energy by 2030. Investment in renewable energy sources jumped 65%. In Brazil, expansion of wind power mobilized 8.2 million and created 250,000 jobs. Costa Rica, Chile, and Uruguay committed to become carbon neutral in 2050. ECLAC is advocating for debt reduction for resilience in the Caribbean and the creation of a Caribbean resilience for adaptation. In Latin America and the Caribbean, building back better means reshaping development with equality and sustainability.
Over 3 to 5% of Africa's GDP is lost because of climate change. There are two areas where Africa can contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions. The first is agriculture. The second is energy. In agriculture, two policies that we can put in place. The first is reduce extensive agriculture, do more intensive agriculture, but increase productivity, which will increase yields, add an additional $100 billion to the economy and create 40 million jobs. In energy, Africa today is clearly energy deficient. Over half of our population does not have access to energy. More importantly, industry does not have access to make it competitive and trade globally. Therefore, we will need to produce more energy. Africa has 22,000 megawatts in its national determined contributions. We hope to find financing to do that. That is why Africa is asking for $100 billion to help it get out of the COVID crisis, and special drawing rights to help ensure that we can continue to finance the private sector to ensure that Africa grows back better from the crisis.
Coming out from this pandemic greener will require immense political will. The 2030 Agenda must be our blueprint for our collective action.
Certainly a sobering assessment. The imperatives are really clear, and to reiterate what the narrator there said and the SG said earlier is that we need greater political will. We hope the heads of state and government are watching. If you've just joined us, this is the 2020 SDG Moment. A warm welcome to our viewers from around the world. We now know that from a global perspective, we are moving too slowly to achieve the goals by 2030, and that there are varied but considerable challenges in each and every region. At the same time, our last two presentations also echoed the words of the Secretary General: transformative change is possible. Let's turn now to a presentation about the kind of interventions that are urgently needed to bring about that transformation, based not on theory, but on smart policies and actions that are being advanced by governments and stakeholders around the world. I now have the pleasure to introduce an interactive presentation by the leaders of three key entities of the UN Development System, the administrator of the UN Development Programme, and the executive directors of UN Women and the UN Environment Programme.
A crisis can change the world from one day to the next with tragic consequences. The choices countries make today can lay the foundations for a better future. COVID-19 demonstrates that bold choices and action which seemed unthinkable before are possible. We have unique opportunity to transition towards a fair, equitable and sustainable future. This means tackling poverty, and inequality, climate change, and strengthening gender equality, which also sits at the heart of the 2030 agenda. Inequality is exacerbated by COVID-19. 96 million people are at risk of falling into extreme poverty, widening the gender poverty gap. Critical investments in social protection can help the 4 billion people without access to be more resilient to the effects of the pandemic. Climate change is a threat multiplier, disproportionately affecting the poor. 24.9 million people were forcibly displaced across 140 countries in 2019 because of nearly 1,900 mostly climate-related disasters. They are counting on collective action through Paris Agreement to reverse greenhouse gas emissions. Countries with higher female parliamentary representation are more likely to sign environmental treaties. When women are involved in peace processes, the agreements are more inclusive and durable. But change is too slow. At the current rate of progress, it will take 100 years to close the gender equality gap. Governments and partners have choices that, if correctly combined for the context of each country or group, can translate into a lifelong investment in equality and sustainability. Making those choices starts with a commitment to tackling the complexity of human development.
Excellencies, Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, it's good to be here with you in our UN headquarters, speaking live to the world about this SDG moment. The 2030 Agenda is a universal agenda for humanity, guided by the vision, or as Ola said, our imagination of a sustainable and fair world. But change, as the animation lays out, has been too slow. And now COVID-19 has exposed the implications of tattered safety nets, gender inequalities, and disregard for our planet. The pandemic is a clear warning. Recovery from crisis cannot be driven by a zero-sum game of economy versus environment or health versus economy. Rather, this once-in-a-generation chance to set things straight. And I'm hopeful that this ambition will be met. Over the next 10 minutes, we will tell you a story of what it means to leave no one behind, to put the dignity of every person at the center of building just, sustainable societies and economies. The pandemic is compressing the time it takes to make incredible progress in the face of terrible adversity. And it is shining a light on what has to be done. Together with my dear colleagues Pumzila and Inga, we will explore the courageous choices and policy innovations countries are making right now across the world to tackle the systemic challenges of poverty and inequality, gender inequality, and climate change. Advancing human development means creating opportunities for people through jobs and sustainable economies, but also eradicating the multiple dimensions of poverty and reducing inequality. To achieve this, social protection is an important investment, creating access for everyone to quality basic services, including universal health care. Before COVID, approximately 4 billion, yes, 4 billion people did not have access to social protection. Building people's resilience against vulnerability, risk, and deprivation, and helping them to get on their feet if they falter, defines social protection in the 21st century. This is crucially important given the expected reversal in human development for this year. Consider Colombia. Over the last 20 years, Colombia implemented an integrated social protection system, and it has delivered one of the fastest reductions in multidimensional poverty in the world. When COVID-19 hit, Colombia nearly doubled the number of households receiving social protection benefits in a matter of months. They did so by harnessing the power of digital platforms and modernized financial regulations. The results are expected to mitigate an increase in poverty by almost 5 percentage points. Colombia is not alone in scaling up these innovations. Togo, for example, built a digital cash transfer program from scratch in just 10 days. It now serves 12% of the country's population. Pakistan expanded an existing social protection program by 16 million households, and it now benefits almost half of the country's population. Three things help drive action on social protection. First, go beyond income, to understand who to target, to know who is suffering most or risks falling into poverty. Second, create fiscal space to invest in social protection. And as UNDP found, a 6-month temporary basic income would require only 1/3 of what developing countries owe in external debt payments just in this year 2020. Creating fiscal space also means phasing out expenditures that no longer make sense, like fossil fuel subsidies, as my colleague Inga will speak to in a moment. And third, make digital the default. The pandemic has shown the power of digital solutions to scale quickly, but also the urgent need to close the digital divide that still affects half the world's population. From expanding social protection to upending gender social norms, as my colleague Pumzile will speak to next, social protection is an opportunity for generational change. Thank you.
Thank you, Akim. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. As we celebrate this landmark agreement, COVID-19 threatens to undo the gains made on gender equality over the past 25 years. Women's economic security is in jeopardy. Gender poverty gaps are widening. Gender-based violence is resurgent, and girls' education and maternal health are threatened. In 2021, it is expected there will be 118 women in poverty for every 100 poor men globally, and this could rise by 2030. This would be a stunning reversal for the SDGs. But this kind of backsliding is not a foregone conclusion. With bold policies to boost women's economic empowerment, we can shift costs and accelerate progress instead, whether it is through policies to increase women's employment, including to support skills development and gender equality in science, technology, and innovation, services to support care to reduce women's load or to respond to violence. Countries recognize women's potential and are showing the way. In 2015, Uruguay put in place a publicly financed comprehensive care system for children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. As a result, Uruguay is today one of the leading countries in childcare provision and employment rates for mothers. There are other examples. Georgia and South Africa are supporting women's businesses. Morocco is assisting women's cooperatives. Japan and Sweden have policies to promote equal pay. In Australia, the government is leading the way to boost women's equality in STEM. The UN system is taking these policy insights to support countries on similar pathways. Societies benefit when women can rise to opportunities. A profound transformation of economies is required for a just, sustainable future where women are at the centers. Countries need to invest in care services, education, and skills that will be a backbone of the economies of the future. My colleague, Inga Anderson, will explore the climate action investments needed to transition from a gray to a green economy.
Thank you, Pumzile, and thank you, Akim. Climate action will help achieve multiple goals across the 2030 agenda. The NDCs are at the very heart of translating climate ambition into action. As we mark 5 years on the 2030, we are contending with the warmest climates in Europe. We cannot afford a future powered by fossil fuels, which are the largest single contributors to climate change. We committed in Paris to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 centigrades. But projections show that by 2030, we will produce 120% more fossil fuel. This dangerous path could see us double emissions by 2050. As countries construct their response plans, they cannot afford to take their eyes off the relationship between people and planet. As we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. Renewable energy is part of the solution, and we are making progress around the world. South Africa invested $20 billion in renewable energy over the last 8 years. Renewable energy creates jobs. It could create 42 million jobs by 2050, with higher gender parity as compared to traditional energy sectors. And nature's infrastructure holds answers to sustainable, inclusive recovery that drives down poverty and upends gender inequalities. Consider the Sahel. Bordering the Sahara Desert, the Sahel is on the front lines of the climate crisis. The ambitious Great Green Wall, a collaboration from Senegal to Djibouti, contributes to 15 of the 17 SDGs. It's restoring ecosystems, accelerating growth and jobs, and combating climate change. The Secretary General has set out 6 steps for climate action. We need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, redirect finance from nature negative into nature positive flows, invest in renewables, and as we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. We need to invest in nature. Excellencies, COVID-19 is a challenge of our lifetimes, but it is also an opportunity to correct conditions that brought us here. A green, inclusive recovery provides a policy space to make long overdue changes to our socioeconomic architecture and to rebalance our relationship with the environment. We must head off the long-term consequences of digital exclusion, including for the millions of children who are left without access to online education. We must offer decent jobs that also protect our natural assets, especially for our young people who will bear the burden or the fruit of the choices that we make today. We must rely on international cooperation and frameworks to steer our paths, and we must do whatever it takes to contain the virus without taking our eyes off the future we want. The world was ill-prepared to confront the devastating effects of COVID-19. We're not here today because of the virus. We're here in spite of it. Our choices matter. This is our decade of transformation.
Thank you to all our presenters of the last segment and for the animators and producers behind the amazing visualizations. We have heard that progress has been made, but we have so much more to do. We have seen the possibilities that lie ahead, and we know that to grasp them, we need to make bold choices. In the next segment, we will hear directly from heads of state and government and the leaders of regional organizations about the gaps they face in their SDG implementation to accelerate progress over the coming decade. To begin, we will hear from the person who presides over the global town hall of our global village and the ultimate home of the 2030 Agenda. I have the great honor to introduce His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the 75th session, the historic 75th session of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, sir, you have the floor.
His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, His Excellency Ambassador Munir Akram, President of ECOSOC. Excellencies, I'm honored to address you all today at this inaugural SDG moment. When mandated by the General Assembly, few of us could have known the setbacks the pandemic would cause the SDGs and the urgency that this would present us today. In less than a year, we have seen social and economic damage on a scale not seen since the Second World War. At least 71 million people are being pushed into extreme poverty. Approximately 270 million people face acute food insecurity. And an estimated 1.6 billion children and youth have seen their education threatened. Allow me to be frank. Progress on the SDGs was inconsistent and, of course, well before COVID-19 shook the world. The pandemic has unveiled the dangers inherent in today. It has reminded us starkly of the need to act. Not since the United Nations was founded has the world required such levels of collaboration, cooperation, and dialogue. These are the moments for which we were built. It is for this reason that I have included the SDGs and Decade of Action amongst the priorities of the 75th session. Halting to the spread of COVID-19 and regaining progress against the SDGs must be our collective priority. Countries in special situations, including the least developed countries, should be prioritized. It will not be easy, but the SDGs themselves provide us the very blueprint needed to recover better. We must look to 2020 with renewed vigor. The pandemic may have set us back, but it can also be the board from which we bounce back further and faster. As countries across the globe embark upon socio-economic recovery plans, let them be guided by the SDGs. Let us choose a more equal, more green, more resilient world. On this, I'm confident that UNDP and the broader UN system, under the guidance of the Deputy Secretary General, are accelerating efforts at the national level. As I open this segment on SDG gaps and plans, I urge heads of state and governments to share the plans and measures to innovate and inspire greater action through transformative pathways over the course of the decade. I support the efforts of the Secretary General in the reform agenda and appreciate the timely and far-reaching reforms of the United Nations development system. UN country teams are key players in this crucial effort and must continue to support national efforts and priorities, particularly around COVID recovery and the SDGs. The Decade of Action may have started with a global emergency and a dramatic setback, but we can choose to let this strengthen our resolve. We can choose to go forward with unwavering ambition to achieve the SDGs while overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic. Let this be the moment that we make the choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good luck as you preside over what will be a historic virtual UN 75 high-level week next week. Regional cooperation between countries has proven to be a critical driver of peace and prosperity over the last 75 years. In this spirit, we will now hear from the leader of the Secretariat of one of the crucial regional organizations, His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies, distingués invités. L'année 2020 marque le début de la décennie d'action et de mise en œuvre des objectifs de développement durable lancés par les dirigeants du monde lors de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies dédiée à cet effet. C'est également le début de la décennie à parcourir avant la fin de l'année butoir des ODD en 2030, soit 3 ans avant l'expiration du premier plan décennal de la mise en œuvre de l'agenda africain, l'agenda 2063. Après 2 décennies de croissance économique soutenue et d'amélioration significative dans le secteur social, le continent était sur la bonne voie pour transformer ses impressionnantes performances économiques afin d'atteindre les niveaux de développement social observés dans d'autres régions du monde. En effet, le continent s'apprêtait à prendre les mesures idoines pour opérationnaliser la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine et accélérer les rythmes de mise en œuvre de l'agenda 2063 et des ODD. Cependant, il vient d'être interrompu dans son élan par l'une des pandémies les plus meurtrières que le monde ait jamais connues. Ce qui a commencé comme une simple crise sanitaire s'est rapidement transformé en l'une des pires crises économiques, sociales et humanitaires et est en train de bouleverser tous les progrès socio-économiques importants réalisés ces dernières années. Dès les premiers instants de l'apparition du virus de la COVID-19 en Afrique, l'Union africaine a créé un fonds de réponse à la COVID-19, initié plusieurs réunions de haut niveau avec le bureau de la conférence des chefs d'État et des communautés économiques régionales, avec les ministres des Finances, de l'Agriculture, de la Santé et de l'Emploi, pour mieux coordonner la stratégie continentale de riposte à la pandémie et les efforts du continent dans la mobilisation des ressources financières. L'Afrique a également mis en place un panel d'envoyés spéciaux pour assister les pays dans la négociation du traitement de la dette publique africaine et la mobilisation des ressources tant au niveau intérieur qu'extérieur. Cependant, ces efforts restent limités compte tenu de l'ampleur des dommages causés par la pandémie. À cet égard, la solidarité mondiale est indispensable, car la pandémie est un défi mondial qui exige que tout le monde travaille ensemble avec un niveau maximum de coopération. C'est une opportunité historique pour rebâtir en mieux les valeurs du multilatéralisme. Pour l'Afrique, la pandémie offre aussi l'occasion de transformer cette crise en une opportunité, en changeant son modèle de développement et en bâtissant des économies plus diversifiées, plus endogènes et plus résilientes vis-à-vis des chocs exogènes. La diversification structurelle des économies à travers la transformation productive, la création de valeur ajoutée aux matières premières et l'utilisation de la digitalisation devrait permettre à l'Afrique de tirer meilleur profit de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, dont la mise en œuvre devrait accroître le commerce intra-africain de 15 à 25% et d'environ 50 à 70 milliards de dollars d'ici 2040. Accélérer la croissance économique et créer de nombreux emplois et opportunités d'épanouissement pour les femmes et les jeunes, ainsi qu'au développement durable. L'Union africaine appelle à plus de solidarité, à plus d'équité, à plus de justice, à plus d'humanité, pour qu'ensemble, nous bâtissons un monde meilleur pour tous. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
I thank the leader of the African Union Commission. Unlike its predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals The Sustainable Development Goals apply universally because people are being left behind in every country, and because development is a constant process of change and improvement. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we will hear from 23 countries across different regions. What we will see are the unique circumstances, starting points, and contexts in which each country finds itself. But we will also see a range of common and shared regional and global challenges. We will begin with 6 countries from across Africa. We have heard about the trends in poverty reduction, climate, and gender equality in Africa, from slowdown in poverty trends and economic growth to the existential threats of climate change. We will now learn how these trends translate into specific challenges of a group of countries from the region and the plans that these countries have put in place to address them. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government from Angola, Botswana, Nigeria, Seychelles, my country, South Africa, and Morocco.
Excelência, Senhor Secretário-Geral das Nações Unidas, Excelência, Senhor Chefe de Estado e de Governo, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Saúdo todos os presentes com votos de muito boa saúde, principalmente no momento que o mundo vive uma profunda crise econômica, financeira e social provocada pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola reafirma o seu compromisso de trabalhar pelos 17 Objetivos do Desenvolvimento Sustentável no quadro da Agenda 2030, intitulada Transformar o Nosso Mundo, para que os mesmos sejam alcançados no nosso país, com particular realce para a eliminação da pobreza extrema e a redução significativa dos níveis de pobreza multidimensionais até ao ano 2030. O primeiro objetivo do desenvolvimento sustentável foi definido como sendo a erradicação da pobreza, facto que ganha muito mais importância depois dos fundamentos da economia mundial terem sido fortemente abalados por este forte choque negativo provocado pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola atribui uma grande importância às questões relativas ao combate à pobreza e à elevação do bem-estar e da qualidade de vida das populações. Por esta razão, dos 70 programas de ação que integram o Plano de Desenvolvimento Nacional de Angola para o período 2018-2022, 36 têm incidência sobre a meta da eliminação da pobreza extrema e da redução da pobreza multidimensional. Estes programas de combate à pobreza estão definidos com base nos seguintes eixos de atuação: as transferências monetárias, a inclusão produtiva ou geração de trabalho e renda, a ampliação das infraestruturas e da oferta de bens, a ampliação dos serviços sociais com destaque para a alfabetização, o ensino e a saúde, e o reforço da capacidade institucional, sobretudo no domínio da assistência social às crianças, às mulheres, aos jovens e aos idosos. Gostaríamos de destacar o início, a 30 de maio do corrente ano, da implementação de um programa de transferências sociais monetárias que irá abranger 1.600.000 famílias. Este programa, em parceria com o Banco Mundial e que se estenderá até o ano 2022, inclui um pacote financeiro equivalente a 420 milhões de dólares americanos. Numa altura em que, devido a restrições orçamentais e financeiras, a função pública em Angola não está a admitir novos agentes, aumentamos consideravelmente o número de profissionais nos setores da saúde e da educação. Foram abertas mais de 19.000 vagas para professores do ensino geral em 2018 e cerca de 10.000 vagas em 2019, totalizando mais de 29.000 vagas para o sistema de ensino geral só nos últimos 2 anos. No setor da saúde, foram abertas cerca de 7.600 vagas em 2018, enquanto que em 2019 foram abertas 7.000 vagas perfazendo um total de 14.600 profissionais de saúde. No domínio das infraestruturas para o Sistema Nacional de Saúde, o nosso país fez um importante investimento nos últimos 2 anos, tendo aumentado o número de camas disponíveis nos hospitais em 5.382 unidades. Foram inaugurados novos hospitais em várias localidades do país, aumentando-se assim a oferta dos cuidados intensivos de saúde. Tendo em conta a sua grande importância na economia de Angola, a produção alimentar familiar constitui um pilar de enorme relevância nos esforços do governo de Angola de combate à pobreza.
Mr. President, let me start by echoing Botswana's appreciation for the convening of this high-level event, dubbed the SDG Moment. We find this initiative opportune as it has great potential to provide sustained impetus for SDGs implementation during this decade of action. Botswana, like many other countries, has been negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which came at a time when my government had just set out a transformative development agenda in line with the 2030 agenda to propel Botswana to greater heights. The unstable global economy has caused disruptions and fiscal constraints that exacerbated the existing national budget deficit. Our worsened fiscal position will curtail efforts geared towards SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. This could ignite negative ripple effects on the country's performance of other SDGs, given the interlinkages. It is indisputable that our ongoing efforts to develop high multiplier effects in job creation run the risk of being reversed by the impact of COVID-19. The small, medium, and micro enterprises are the hardest hit, as they lack the resilience to deal with the effects of the pandemic. Consequently, the purchasing power of households has been eroded, leaving many families looking up to government for assistance. Mr. President, Botswana, with her limited resources, has come up with a short-term COVID-19 economic relief package to support the economy and complement disease containment measures. The package covers interventions such as additional health expenditure, deferment of corporate tax on profit payable by firms, and a loan guarantee scheme to support access to bank credit by affected firms. Moreover, non-fiscal measures adopted include easing the monetary policy and introduction of additional liquidity measures for commercial banks to enable them to support economic activity. Botswana has also developed an economic recovery and transformation plan, which will complement the short-term economic relief package. Mr. President, my government is committed to closing implementation gaps to turn the COVID-19 crisis into a catalyst towards achieving the SDGs. As such, we have collaborated with the UN team in Botswana to develop comprehensive SDGs planning guidelines. The government will also develop an SDG financing strategy and its core institutional components through the design and implementation of an integrated national financing framework. This will strategically position Botswana to identify and leverage domestic and international public and private finance to support the realization of national priorities and SDGs. Botswana intends to collaborate with the international community to apply advanced fourth industrial revolution technologies towards the implementation of her development agenda. Another expected impact is efficiency in spending, cost containment, and avoidance of wastage to effectively deliver public services within the public sector. Mr. President, let me conclude by reaffirming Botswana's commitment and readiness to doing her part towards implementation of our internationally agreed development goals, aimed at leaving no man, woman, or child behind. We thus remain steadfast and determined to build back better and faster. Thank you for your attention.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government and people of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, I congratulate Your Excellency Volkan Bozkır on your election as President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I would also like to congratulate His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General for convening the maiden edition of the Sustainable Development Goals movement. Nigeria is delighted to be part of this event, which affords us the opportunity as global leaders to reinforce our dedication to achieving the SDGs. I therefore commend the Secretary General for taking steps to place the Decade of Action on SDGs at the center of the crucial high-level week of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Excellencies, Nigeria has made good strides in Sustainable Development Goals domestication processes, as we have commenced the realignment of the national statistical system with the requirements and indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have developed a novel homegrown integrated Sustainable Development Goals model as an analytical framework for assessing how policy making can better address the indivisible nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. Nigeria has also set up a model private sector advisory group and an SDGs donors forum with a view to engaging critical stakeholders toward the attainment of the SDGs. I wish to recall that Nigeria presented its second voluntary national review on the Sustainable Development Goals to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July 2020. The second voluntary national review highlighted our efforts to meet Sustainable Development Goals targets on the critical issues of poverty and an inclusive economy, health and well-being, education and gender equality, enabling environment of peace and security, and partnerships. This was based on our current development priorities as captured in our Economic Recovery and Growth Plan 2017 to 2020, as well as our medium-term National Development Plan 2020 to 2025. Nigeria is also committed to mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals into our subsequent development plans. In this decade of action, Nigeria will implement unique initiatives aimed at accelerating the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Such initiatives include the realigned national statistical system to effectively track and monitor the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals on an annual basis. The Nigeria Integrated Sustainable Development Goals simulation model to support the domestication of the planning model across the 36 states, the integrated national financing frameworks for the Sustainable Development Goals, the scaled-up National Social Investments Program to reach more poor and vulnerable Nigerians in line with our commitment to lift 100 million people out of poverty within a 10-year period, and the engaging of all segments of the society for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Similarly, our National Assembly has established committees on Sustainable Development Goals. The National Youth Service Scheme is also ensuring that Nigerian graduates actively participate in the Sustainable Development Goals implementation processes by serving as SDGs champions at the grassroots. In addition, we have also strengthened our anti-corruption institutions to enable us more effectively combat illicit financial flows and recover its proceeds. Excellencies, in line with our administration's priority, Nigeria inaugurated the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development Task Force team in July 2017. The team was saddled with the responsibility of developing a new framework for measuring officially supported resources for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, the coronavirus pandemic has altered our socio-economic dynamics and threatened to derail our progress on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. To address this, we have rededicated efforts towards diversifying our economy, focusing on agriculture and the mining sectors. Having observed that policy incoherence and trade-offs pose significant challenge to us, we will pay greater attention to interlinkages and mainstream sustainability assessment into the annual cycle of our policy planning, as well as budgeting and the reporting processes. Going forward, we will invigorate the goal achievement process as a grassroots by engaging the services of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals ambassadors we appointed to support our efforts at the national level. We will also encourage more subnational authorities to appoint and train Sustainable Development Goals champions. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me conclude by reaffirming Nigeria's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and other internationally agreed development goals. You can count on the support of our administration in our collective quest to achieve these noble objectives. Thank you.
Dear honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this first annual SDG moment is a rallying call for us all. The SDGs unite us around a shared future threatened not only by COVID-19, but by the existential threat of climate change. This shared future is about more than just socio-economic progress. It is about saving lives. Last month, Seychelles celebrated the 250th anniversary of its settlement. Over these 2.5 centuries, a nation has been forged from a melting pot of continents, from the pain of slavery. A nation has been built on the spirit of unity in diversity. This is what Seychelles stands for. A small island developing state, conscious of our isolation, but also aware of our potential, a large ocean nation. Today, the fruits of our labor speak for themselves. The Republic of Seychelles presented its very first voluntary national review in July of this year as its blueprint for SDG implementation. Our successes were notable in areas such as education, health, as well as in environmental protection and conservation. As an island nation, we are inherently vulnerable to external shocks. Climate change underlines this vulnerability, coupled with a narrow resource base and associated challenges of resource mobilization, human resource constraints, and regional maritime security risk. While we have led the way in responding to COVID-19 with no cases of local transmission, the economic impact has been dramatic. For Seychelles, this has meant foregoing some of the hard-fought economic gains and adopting contingency plans focused on protecting our population. This is our foremost priority. I urge all our partners to review criteria currently being used to measure development and ensure that an appropriate focus on vulnerability is captured. The SDGs require us to look beyond GDP. They require us to invest in well-being of citizens. There is no better time in this decade of action to adopt a vulnerability index that can allow us to better target resources for development. The interrelatedness of the SDGs will mean that the COVID-19 pandemic will have systemic effects on our performance in almost all the goals. With an economy heavily reliant on tourism and services, the pandemic has dealt a blow to the livelihoods of thousands. As a global collective, we must also turn to nature to find solutions to the problems we face. In accelerating our economic development, we acknowledge the vast potential of the ocean and the blue economy as catalysts of transformative economic growth through which we all can benefit. We must recognize the true value of our natural capital to fight climate change. Seychelles' decision to protect over 1/3 of its exclusive economic zone is driven by the recognition that we all have a responsibility to solve this problem. In doing so, we will also create new economic opportunities that are anchored in the protection of nature. We need to turn the same urgency of response to COVID-19 to tackle climate change. In the teeth of the crisis created by COVID-19, we are proceeding with remedial policy responses which will contribute towards bringing Seychelles back on track to achieving the SDGs. In March of this year, the government launched a flagship initiative, the Financial Assistance for Job Retention Scheme, which is catering for the salaries of businesses hardest hit by the adverse effects of COVID-19. A nation such as ours does not have unlimited resources to inject into the response to COVID-19. While we seek to diversify, we do not have a million options to choose from. However, we are determined to protect our people. We are determined to make this decade of action meaningful. Today's reality has put all of us to the test, and in the true Seychelles spirit, the people of Seychelles have risen to the occasion. My fellow SDG champions, despite the threat of the pandemic, we must remain focused on our journey to forge our way towards a brighter, more equitable and sustainable future. Let us work together with unwavering resolve, leaving no one behind. I thank you.
Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa welcomes this opportunity to engage on accelerated global action towards sustainable development. As we do so, we face the reality that the immense resources we have directed to fighting the coronavirus pandemic have severely set back our ability to realize the Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, this is an unprecedented opportunity to build back better and fairer. For Africa, the path we must take is clear. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a lodestar for transforming our world and the template for global cooperation and partnership. We must invest in our people. We must provide developing countries with the means to achieve the SDGs. We must ensure technology transfer and capacity building support. We must ensure that no country is left behind. We must also prioritize those countries with special needs and circumstances, including least developed countries, small island developing states, and countries in conflict or under occupation. Regrettably, the multilateral response to advancing sustainable development has experienced setbacks on many fronts. This has been in no small part due to the impact of the pandemic. Some countries have reneged on their multilateral commitments. It is our hope that member states will find common course in this ambitious, forward-looking and truly transformative global agenda. Our experience with COVID-19 has really demonstrated what can be achieved if we act and work together to address global challenges. In the face of the pandemic, African countries have acted with determination and resolve. The African Union is developing a comprehensive response to COVID-19, addressing the economic and social and environmental pillars of sustainable development. Working together as countries, as the international community, and with our development partners, it is within our means to meet the aspirations of Agenda 2030. It is within our means to eradicate poverty and inequality and to bring about greater economic justice and conserve our natural world for future generations. I thank you.
And we will leave with the United Nations, where the SDG Moment 2020 was being held. The event was convened by the United Nations Secretary General with the head of states and leaders to identify the changes needed to recover better from COVID-19. With this, we have come to the end of this news brief. Keep in touch and continue with us to be updated about the SDG Moment in United Nations in the next emission. For TeleSUR English, I'm Laura Palmeiro. Thank you for watching.